Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, llamas, farmers and snake charmers, welcome along to the Joe Spivey YouTube channel where we discuss books and little else. And you join me, as per usual, in northern Britain, and I may have mentioned the other day that my mother very, very selfishly had herself what's termed a vasovagal incident, and she is apparently riddled with sort of anxiety and all sorts of executive stress, and therefore needs to be fetched and carried for, and is now bedridden. And so I have briefly interrupted my benevolence and my charity and my servile nature in her cause to make a very, very hopefully enjoyable video on Adam Zamoyski's 1812 Napoleon's fatal retreat from Moscow. Brief interludes to start with. Britain is there are a lot of idiots wintering in Britain just now. We have Slavoj Žižek, who is a bloviating buffoon of the left, who is on a book tour, probably on a book tour titled something like Comfortable Communism or something like that, talking about Lenin on trains and talking about Donald Trump and all of this type of thing. We've got Ben Shapiro honouring us with his presence, who is ensuring that nobody can draw moral equivalence between X and Y, and making sure that the atrocity of one baby's death is different to the atrocity of another baby's death. A weird statement from somebody that has always espoused that apparently facts don't care about feelings. We have Dominic Cummings, who was the key conspirator and catalyst of Boris Johnson's assumption of political power in 2019, spewing out all sorts of excoriatory and pejorative nonsense at his COVID inquiry. And then we have, of course, body language experts, fraudsters, people who have made kinesics their life's work, telling us that he's nervous whilst doing this, and pensive whilst doing this, and the fact that folding your arms is apparently hugely defensive, and, he's not telling the truth here. Oh, do you reckon he's not telling the truth? That aside, as I say, this is going to be a hopefully rather long, prolonged review of Adam Zamoyski's 1812 Napoleon's fatal march on Moscow. Now, if you've been living under a literary rock for a little while, Non-Fiction November is our booktube event here, whereby if you are an imbecile and don't read non-fiction at all, very, very stupidly, you should read some, and if you are erudite and already read some, like myself and I'm sure many of you others, you are essentially supposed to drown in a glen of non-fiction for November. So that's the event, and we are ploughing ahead with it just now. So then, a little bit of background for this thing. Written in 2004, Zamoyski is essentially just a freelancer, a jobbing scribbler. He hasn't got any kind of cushy role at the New Statesman or any kind of any kind of stupid, he's not at the helm of a think tank. He doesn't seem to have any other income apart from, obviously, his ancestral income and his role as a freelance writer. He might do a bit of teaching. But a little bit of historical context. French Revolution of 1789, and then Napoleon's assumption of power a little bit later on, essentially means that France is at war with every single European power it can shake a stick at. The only two expansionary powers that Mr. Bonaparte fears in the early 19th century are Russia and Great Britain, and he imposes the continental system on the entire continent, which is essentially a trade embargo on British exports, and therefore the countries that import them pay a huge hiked sum for silks and any other things that Britain might be supplying from their colonial annexes. And so you've got many things like economic discontent in Russia going ahead and things of that nature. You have the Battle of Friedland, I think I'm pronouncing correctly, where the French utterly batter the Russians. I think it's about 1807, and after that you have the Treaty of Tilsit signed by Tsar Alexander of Russia and Mr. Bonaparte, who is at the helm of France, and Alexander is a rather slightly naive, dewy-eyed liberal, and somebody who completely falls hook, line, and sinker for Napoleon's munificence and all of his sort of flummery. And that essentially means that they are then therefore in league with France, and anything that they do which would seek to contravene that treaty, Napoleon is going to see as horrid. Napoleon tries to reinforce the bond by potentially marrying Alexander's sister-in-law, Count Anna. This doesn't go ahead. He goes on to marry Marie-Louise or something, so that doesn't work out. There is the Duchy of Warsaw, which is, I believe, a part of Austria, which Napoleon essentially just marches into and takes dominion over. And Alexander tells him, come on, Mr. Bonaparte, that's a little bit much. If you wouldn't mind getting out of there, because I think that's how you're going to try to sneak into Russia and usurp me. Napoleon doesn't do that, and war is declared, and all of the time, Napoleon is seeking to expand his empire. And so it is in June of 1812, they cross the Niemen River, and you have Alexander, who, as I say, is a little wet behind the ears. He's never actually at military command. He has initially Mr. Barclay, who takes command, and the first battle for the Russians is at Smolensk, which is a victory that comes at a great cost. It may be said that the best part of, I think it's about 500,000 men go into, 600,000 go into Russia under Napoleon's orders. Smolensk is won at great cost, and it is very, very soon revealed that Smolensk wasn't that great a city to be after all together. It doesn't hold great strategic utility for the emperor, and they've lost a load of people doing it. They then go on to... Barclay is then replaced by General or Commander Kutuzov, who is a much older individual who has, I think, much of the Ancien Regime behind him, sort of bearded, but then turns out not to be very good in general anyway. You have the Battle of Borodino, which takes place largely on a redoubt, which is a little bit of a fortress. Fierce, horrid, and therefore very, very deathly hand-to-hand fighting takes place. Worth mentioning that the Russians relied mainly on manpower and particularly strong artillery. Lots of their militia was essentially just serfs and people conscripted in the few months leading up to the war, not the trained, sort of war-hardened veterans that the French could boast. Back and forth. They both declare victory after the Battle of Borodino. Kutuzov and his lot do indeed retreat, and Napoleon advances. Then, of course, we have the famous march into Moscow from Napoleon. This is all ludicrously brief, but I'm trying to just get through it and give you a little bit of a telling of the tale, which Zamoyski does very well. I'll get into the critical analysis soon. So Napoleon gets into Moscow, and there is a huge fire which rages for days and days and days. This is the first bit where, obviously I've enjoyed the book thus far, but this was the first bit where I thought, Zamoyski's doing something rather serious here, because it has been a matter of historical ambiguity for lots as to the emanation of this fire. Tolstoy, probably the most prominent example, which essentially says, it's just happenstance, just accident. It's 60-70% of Russia's metropolis is made up of wooden houses. There's gusts of wind. Random camps of soldiers are starting fires. These things are bound to happen. Zamoyski says, no, there was a governor of Moscow who, just before fleeing, conscripted hundreds and hundreds of soldiers to deliberately go out and make a concerted effort to burn buildings and essentially raze the thing to the ground. So Zamoyski doesn't admit that there's any historical ambiguity. It was started by the Russians deliberately by Rostopchin, who was the governor of Moscow at the time. Napoleon twiddles his thumbs in Moscow for, I think, the best part of 2 or 3 weeks. And again, Zamoyski points out that if he would have in fact followed Kutuzov to Tarutino instead of sort of just sitting there and continually messaging, what a neologism, continually writing letters to, or continually having letters sent to Alexander saying, "Come on, mate, we've got the ground. We'll give it up to you. Just come on. I think I've got the upper hand now." But what Napoleon doesn't realise is, or what Napoleon is doing, is going to have his bluff called, because little did he know really that Moscow isn't nearly the political melting point and fulcrum that it is today in Russia. Much of the stuff is all done in St. Petersburg, which is where Alexander has fled to or lives now, and taking Moscow isn't that great a victory. It is very much given up by much of the Russians. They all leave. And so Napoleon thinks he's gaining the upper hand when in fact he's not really doing anything much at all. Then, of course, he has to leave. Meanwhile, it's been a glorious summer or autumn in Russia. It's been, I think it's about 10, 15 degrees, which on that northern plain is remarkable. It's been boiling hot. It's been better than France at that time of year, it's often said in the diary entries. So then they retreat, but Napoleon refuses to acknowledge that it's a retreat and names it as a sort of much more of a tactical withdrawal, and wants very much to reassemble many of his troops and march again. Kutuzov crucially fails to intercept many of them as they retreat back towards Krasny and Smolensk. So many people. I can't. There's Bagration. There is Yermolov. All of them are saying essentially that this Kutuzov is a complete and utter fool. He is very, very reticent about and very cautious towards Napoleon. Obviously, this is a megalomaniac, adamantine, nominal military genius. Doesn't want to interact with him whatsoever. Doesn't want to go into the field of battle with him if he can help it. And so he misses out on a big opportunity. They then flee back to Smolensk, and then the horror starts. Never has a book, nothing I've ever read. Obviously, I've read the Sergeant Burgoyne entries, but never have I ever read anything that so orchestrates utter depravity, human depravity, to such an extent. We'll get into that with the extracts that I've got to retail or to read out. But yeah, it's just incites such visceral disgust and horror, even for somebody who is living in the materially abundant 21st century. It's foul and really wretch-worthy. But they go to Smolensk. They then go back to Orsha, and then they go to the river of, I'm going to forget this, Bresnia. Do I want to say Bresnia? Brezina, where they build bridges over a river. It's now -12 at warmest for the next 6 weeks and goes to much colder temperatures. They manage to escape barely. They're still fighting. Some are still escaping. Some are still fighting. Bear in mind, most of the French army are, it's a complete motley crew of Frenchmen, Poles, Italians, Austrians, Prussians, even a few Spaniards and Portuguese. So it's a complete motley crew, and they get over. They then get back into Vilna. Napoleon departs and says his General Murat needs to take over, and says, I'm going to come back soon. Don't worry, I'm going to gather myself a great army and come back. Murat soon realizes that that's a sort of false cause, and then essentially they all retreat. Napoleon is unrecognizable when he gets back to Paris. He's wearing all sorts of garb to keep himself warm, and it's an utter disaster. 1 million men die accumulatively on either side in 6 weeks in the most arrantly awful circumstances it could be possible to conceive. And that's the Russian campaign. A real terrible loss for Napoleon, and his military reputation and his political reputation on the European scene is stultified and forever put to ruin, essentially. And it's essentially his last success, which is unfortunate for some viewers, unfortunate some dead. But yeah, I've got a few sections that I wanted to highlight just to show you how good Zamoyski is. I was asking myself before doing this video what the role of the historian is, or how we might want to define that. Essentially, he's got a few jobs to do. First of all, he's got to unravel a rather rickety steel deck chair, which is cold. He's got to wrap you in the uniform that they were wearing. He's got to put the hat that you had on. He's got to make sure that he grows you the beard. He's got to tell you what it was like at the time and give you a front row seat as to what was going on. He's got to jumble many sources, so a little bit of a diary entry here, a little bit of more specificity with facts here, a little bit of narrative retelling here, a little bit of human contingency here, if, whats, maybes and buts and despites and in result ofs, all sorts of conditional stuff that the historian has to wade through, which is where Holloway's work is done in the office, just compiling first and secondary, primary and secondary sources. He's got to make it interesting as well. He's got to put you in an armchair by the fireside with a comfortable blanket on you, serving you his best wine and his finest food. There's so much he has to do, and it's got to be written with some level of verisimilitude. It can't just be hagiographic propaganda. So it's a really difficult task, and I think when done well is easily one of the most congratulatory and salutary efforts on behalf of writers, whether that's non-fiction or fiction. So I have a few sections to read out to you. So this shows on what real false pretensions the battle was, or the campaign was fought anyway in the first instance. Historians have said that essentially it was just two bulky men trying to scare each other off, but never actually wanted to come to hand-to-hand combat. So this is of Napoleon's intentions. He wanted to, this is talking about Russia, he wanted to frighten her, but he did not want to destroy her as a power. He wanted to co-opt her as an ally against Britain. There was no other reason for France to go to war with Russia. There was nothing Russia had that France could possibly have wanted. The only other conceivable motive for confronting Russia was to force her out of her newly dominant position in European affairs and neutralise her ability to threaten France. And when you think about all of the depravity that ensues from this engagement, it's hard not to view Napoleon and Alexander and all leaders that led hundreds of thousands of men to a grisly death as complete and utter gits. But yeah, Zamoyski evokes all of it really well. And this is the start of the terror. So obviously they've got Napoleon's armies can march, especially in southern Europe, in warm climates, easily march 50 kilometres a day, laden with all their stuff. They have ludicrously ostentatious uniforms that they use, and they can march, 30 miles for ages and ages and ages, for days on end, and that's with insouciance. That's no trouble. That's just, they're trained to do that. And they do that by ensuring that they have obviously enough stuff. They have enough straw or horse fodder in front of them. They march at speed and leave bases behind for when they come back with the fruits of victory, and so they can advance really quickly. That isn't possible in Russia because you can't go and plunder a load of villages if there aren't any villages to plunder. It is, I don't know whether Napoleon knew this beforehand, Russia is quite barren. I don't know whether you've ever been, but there's not an awful lot to it apart from two major cities that we've mentioned. And so you can't rely on that constant supply of sustenance, of victuals, of libations, of prostitution, the fair sex. And so it's very, very difficult to move at speed. And then before you know it, things turn utterly horrendous. And I'll give you a few examples. If you have anybody under the age of 18 that is liable to squeal or to empty their lunch out onto the carpet floor, please remove them from the room now because it's about to get grisly, folks. So this is talking about the horse's diet and what the soldiers had to do in order to make sure that they were making sure that their fecal matter was coming out of their bodies and not staying there and constipating them. One artillery officer recorded that he and his men would have to plunge their arms up the poor creatures' anuses, up to the elbow, in order to pull out rock-hard lumps of dung. Without such attentions, their stomachs would blow up and explode. So the horses aren't having a really good time of it. We have another section here, which will undoubtedly... Yes, so this is by far the worst section of it. So this is coming back from Borodino. Advancing from Borodino to Russia, I think. And this is where all of a sudden everything just goes completely a mess. Nobody has anything to eat. They consider cannibalism. They eat things alive. They eat their horses alive because things were freezing so quickly that you couldn't just chop up a dead horse because the meat would have been frozen by that point. They had to eat the horse alive and the most plentiful parts of that are the liver and the heart and all of the entrails and intestines. And this is then also after Borodino, when he sees all of the melee after that. So this is one officer's depiction of it. As his horse picked its way between the debris of men, horses and equipment, he saw that one general called the most disgusting sight he had ever seen. Since most of the carnage had been performed by artillery fire, the ground was covered in mangled corpses with exposed entrails and severed limbs. Wounded men struggled to free themselves from under dead men and horses, or dragged themselves in the direction of some perceived succour. Wounded horses crushed them as they themselves attempted to get to their feet. One could see some which, horribly disemboweled, nevertheless kept standing, their heads lung low, drenching the soil with their blood, or, hobbling painfully in search of some pasture, dragged beneath them shreds of harness, sagging intestines, or a fractioned member, or else lying flat on their sides, lifted their heads from time to time to gaze on their gaping wounds. The approaches, the ditches, and the earthwork itself had disappeared under a mound of dead and dying, of an average depth of 6 to 8 men heaped upon one another. 6 to 8 rows of men, all piled up on one another, essentially a dead sandwich. And what Zamoyski does really well is to, because he goes on brilliantly, I'll try and find the section here, to talk about how very quickly normalised that became for people. And he does it really well by mentioning such barbarity and such depravity so very often. He normalises it for yourself. Let me just try and talk about the bits with the barbarians. Sorry about this, guys. Talk amongst yourselves. So yeah, it's completely horrible. They all start eating each other. Okay, here we are. I've put in my annotations. This is the worst section yet. This is again an account of a Frenchman who's in charge of the Russian prisoners. I saw, and I do not admit this without a certain sense of shame, I saw some Russian prisoners carried to the very limit by the ravening hunger that possessed them, since there were not enough rations for our soldiers, throw themselves on the body of a Bavarian who had just expired, tear him to pieces with knives, and devour the bloody shreds of his flesh. I can still see the forest, the very tree at the foot of which this horrible scene took place, and I wish I could efface the memory as surely as I fled the sight of it. It's rank and it's horrible and it's not very nice at all. But yes, this was ridiculously brilliant. I enjoyed every single step. I enjoyed it every single step of the way. Some of the conclusions drawn at the end by Zamoyski are great, and Napoleon's fall from grace, and then how, of course, he then goes in 1813, I want to say, with my great uncle Wellington, who hurrah boys, part of the Brits, gives the French a damn good thrashing. So that was obviously very pleasurable to read about. But yeah, Zamoyski draws some excellent conclusions at the end, talks about Napoleon's decline, and I thoroughly enjoyed this. It's a reasonably thick one, it's not too bad, and we couldn't really talk about Napoleon, could we, ladies and gents, without referring to our resident favourite on this channel. That is, of course, the 6th Baron Byron of Newstead. You can draw numerous thematic connections between the Romantic movement and Napoleon, about it, particularly when he falls so graciously. Obviously, tragedy is inextricably linked. Heroism is inextricably linked with tragedy. It's very rare that we will commit to the gilded avenues of legend. Somebody who just does good and is continually successful. They've got to have a fall. Obviously, tragedy literature is mixed or completely confused with that type of stuff. But we have Byron's Ode to Napoleon Bonaparte, which is one of my favourites that he wrote, whether I agree with it or not. Just one of the first two stanzas to read out. I really do urge you to go ahead and read this in its entirety. "'Tis done, but yesterday..." This is when he's dead and gone. He's been to Elba and St. Helena. He's all done. "'Tis done, but yesterday a king, and armed with kings to strive, and now thou art a nameless thing, so abject yet alive. Is this the man of 1,000 thrones, who strewed our earth with hostile bones, and can he thus survive? Since he, miscalled the morning star, nor man nor fiend hath fallen so far. Ill-minded man, why scourge thy kind, who bowed so low the knee? By gazing on thyself grown blind, thou taughtest the rest to see." It's just usual brilliance from Lord B there. So yes, that was Adam Zamoyski's 1812. I don't know what the hell I'll be doing for my next non-fiction November, but I thoroughly enjoyed this. Highly recommend it. I think, New York Times, Sunday Times bestseller. It sold in its droves. Quite why I didn't wait another extra 8 years until 2012 to get the bicentenary emoluments, I don't quite know. But that was thoroughly enjoyable. I've ranted on for a little longer than usual, but hopefully you enjoyed this. Thank you ever so much for watching BookTube, and goodbye.